I'm pleased today to welcome Secretary of the Navy Spencer, Admiral Richardson, and General Neller for a review of the Navy and the Marine Corps' fiscal year 2020 budget requests, and also for an update on naval operations. For the year 2020, the Navy and Marine Corps are requesting $205.6 billion, an increase of $9.5 billion over amounts appropriated for 2019. Last year, the Department of Defense received its full budget at the beginning of the fiscal year for the first time in 10 years. In addition to reviewing your 20 requests, we would like to hear how the timely enactment of the 2019 funds is increasing our military readiness and accelerating our modernization. This year's budget request is informed by the 2018 National Defense Strategy, which describes a new era of great power competition with China and Russia. Last week, 2 carrier strike groups with over 10 ships, 130 aircraft, and 9,000 sailors and Marines met up in the Mediterranean for joint operations. It's only the second time in 20 years that the 2 aircraft carriers have operated in the Mediterranean together. Hopefully, you can share some more details about the significance of this event with us today. It certainly shows the role of aircraft carriers to naval operations, and the committee notes yesterday's announcement that the Navy will not decommission the USS Harry S. Truman 25 years early as initially proposed. We would welcome more details on your revised plans. Admiral Richardson, General Neller, I understand this will likely be your last appearance before our subcommittee in your current roles. We certainly appreciate your service to our country and wish you the best in the future. Senator Murray, you have an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me just say, on behalf of our ranking member, my friend Senator Durbin, I am pleased to join you, Senator Shelby, in welcoming today's witnesses here to talk about the fiscal year 2020 Department of the Navy budget request. I know the ranking member would also like for me to extend thank yous to today's witnesses, Admiral Richardson and General Neller, who are appearing before this subcommittee for the last time because of impending retirements. Thank you for your steadfast leadership and decades of service to our nation. Senator Durbin is delayed at another hearing, but if he were here right now, he would mention that it's been nearly 8 months since Hurricane Florence, a storm the size of New Jersey, which pummeled military bases along the East Coast, including the Marine Corps Camp Lejeune and air stations New River and Cherry Point in North Carolina. He would remind our witnesses that due to that natural disaster, our Marines and their families are still living and working under blue tarps and in mold-infested buildings, causing unnecessary illness. And he'd remind our witnesses the Pentagon has nearly $3 billion of reprogramming authority at its disposal that could be used to repair those hurricane-stricken bases and take better care of our service members. And that is a reprogramming I bet would get plenty of bipartisan support if it were sent to Congress. But it's not just our military bases. When it comes to areas in which our armed forces could be investing federal dollars to strengthen national security and improve military readiness, there is no shortage of needs. From strengthening access to affordable, high-quality child care on our military bases to investing in our military families and boosting service member pay and more. However, instead of investing in these priorities that will help ensure our men and women in uniform have the support and resources they need to care for themselves and defend our freedoms, the Department of Defense is saving its reprogramming authority to send even more taxpayer funds to finance President Trump's wall on the southern U.S. border. Mr. Chairman, I know Senator Durbin finds this unacceptable, and so do I, and so should all of us. Our service members and our people are our nation's greatest resource when it comes to keeping our country safe. When we invest in them, we are strengthening our national security because we're ensuring our sailors and Marines on the front lines have what they need to do, the vital job we have asked them to do. We should be strengthening our investments in these and other priorities like improving child care for military families to help ensure the welfare of our service members and the continued strength of our armed forces, not diverting critical federal dollars to fund reckless projects that stem from manufactured crises. I said before that budgets are a statement of our values and priorities, and that is still true today. Just as important, budgets also provide a blueprint to show how we plan to govern and solve the challenges impacting working families in our communities, which is why I find it puzzling the administration has prepared a budget that resorts to gimmicks, cutting funds for the department's baseline budget while simultaneously proposing to pump more and more funds into the Overseas Contingency Operations, or OCO, account, a maneuver that makes for funny budget math, obfuscates the department's investment in personnel and other critical priorities, and attempts to circumvent the principles agreed to by Congress in 3 separate bipartisan deals now for how we should fund both defense and non-defense priorities. Even more rash, this method of budgeting does not allow our military leaders to effectively plan and keeps them guessing if they'll have the resources they need from year to year. So I think it is essential this committee and the Senate take the first steps towards reaching another bipartisan budget agreement. And we will need your help in this process to help us reach a bipartisan agreement that both meets our budgetary obligations and keeps the promise we needed to care for our women and men in uniform. This committee wants to work with each of the leaders on the panel to look out for the best interests of our sailors and Marines, and I look forward to a thorough discussion of these issues and more, and thank all of our witnesses today for being here for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Secretary, Mr. Secretary, we appreciate your appearance today. All of you's written testimony will be made part of the record in its entirety. You proceed as you wish.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Murray, distinguished members of the committee. On behalf of our sailors, Marines, and our civilian teammates, I want to thank you for your bipartisan efforts to provide us timely funding and steady funding. It is the lifeblood of our ability to restore readiness. I do want to take a moment right now, because I'd be remiss if I didn't take a moment to thank the 2 gentlemen on my right and my left. Wearing my Title X hat and coming from corporate America, I can say that these 2 gentlemen were the best business partners that I could imagine to have during the restructuring that we've gone through over the last 22 months. We've pushed the envelope in certain areas, but at all times there was no light between us, and we were in communication and lockstep in all our efforts. And to them, I would like to say thank you. The concept of a strategy is the application of limited resources to attain a goal. Aligned to the National Defense Strategy, the Navy Marine Corps strategy for restoring readiness, strengthening relationships, and reforming our processes has been set. And we're building on that in a disciplined focus that focuses on people, capability, and process. This budget prioritized a strategy-driven, balanced approach to investment. It builds on prior investments, sustains the industrial base, and maintains our competitive advantage as we transition to a more cost-imposing, survivable, and affordable cost of the future. The restoration of readiness is well underway, and we're seeing progress every day. My analogy is that the weather vanes are all pointed in the right direction, and while we might be a bit frustrated with the rate of velocity of the wind, it is increasing every single day. We're building the strength of our team through hiring in areas of critical need, such as cybersecurity specialists, aviation technicians, engineers, scientists, human resource specialists, shipyard workers, and digital warfare officers. In that light, you have provided us the needed resources for hiring experts. One of the things we also must focus on now is to address the ability to have competitive salaries to fill those bills. We're aligning and enhancing our educational institutions and distributed learning venues through the Education for Sea Power review. We're taking aggressive actions to return private military housing to a premium product, mindful that we recruit the individual, but we retain the family. All of these actions have one common thread that runs through them: the goal of increased readiness. We're building our capabilities through investments in hypersonics, machine learning, additive manufacturing, quantum computing, and directed energy. We're building the fleet in pursuit of a 355-ship Navy, manned and unmanned, to include the Columbia-class submarine, the next-generation frigate, and remotely piloted platforms such as Sea Hunter and Orca. These efforts are increasing lethality through increased distributed maritime operations. To reach the Secretary's goal of 80% mission-capable tactical aircraft, we've aligned investments in spare parts, aviation engineering, and logistical support through our newly created Navy sustainment system, looking outside the wire to incorporate commercial best practices in industrial process. An example, our most recent F-18 readiness indicators show a 68% mission-capable Navy F-18 squadrons and 72% mission-capable Marine Corps F-18s, a far sight better than 22 months ago. As a pilot program, these activities have moved us to review our processes in all maintenance areas within the naval enterprise to include ship, weapon, and vehicle maintenance and sustainment. Driven by the Marine Corps Force 2025 capability investment strategy, we're investing in the amphibious combat vehicle, loitering munitions, and unmanned logistical systems in order to maintain and expand our competitive advantage on the margins. Exercising the Marine Corps operating concept is moving us to rapidly progress as a continual learning organization as we adapt and experiment in our new competitive environment. Yet while we effect the aforementioned, the Marine Corps is also contending with the unprecedented double impact of Hurricanes Florence and Matthew, which together damaged and destroyed $3.7 billion of infrastructure across many of our East Coast installations. Camp Lejeune, as many of you know, is a primary force generator for the naval services, directly contributing to the capacity and readiness of our overall force. This area took the majority of the blunt impact of those storms. We need relief through supplemental funding as soon as possible for two reasons. One, the fiscal year is closing upon us, and two, we are about to enter the new hurricane season. We completely appreciate the work this committee has done reprogramming $400 million to immediately begin addressing our most pressing infrastructure needs. And we look forward to working with you to address the remaining $449 million shortfall within fiscal year 19, and then the $2.8 billion required to fully recover. Over the past year, we have meaningfully increased our interaction with our allies and friends. Exercising and education have strengthened our ability to operate and therefore increasing the depth of our collective ability to deliver the resources required. Compared to a year ago, the increase in this depth of our relationship with our allies and friends has been the prime contributor to this excellent outcome. Our Navy has adjudicated 91 of the 111 Readiness Reform and Oversight Council recommendations and fully implemented 83 to date, transforming a culture that was accepting risk to one of understanding and managing risk. We've reviewed and are in the process of remediating our business processes following our first top-to-bottom audit. The audit is now proving to be a tool where we find we can leverage lethality. We're using this information to streamline operations and reimagine how support functions can be modernized to drive continued learning and therefore ever-increasing efficiencies for the American taxpayer. We owe it to them to ensure every dollar we invest, every dollar, is invested in the most effective manner possible. I'm proud to work with this committee to keep that promise. Thank you very much.
Admiral Richardson, you have a statement.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Murray, and distinguished members of the committee, it's a privilege to appear alongside Secretary Spencer and General Neller today to discuss the Navy's fiscal year 2020 budget. At the dawn of our republic, President Jefferson wrote that industry, commerce, and security are the surest roads to happiness and prosperity of our people. The causal link between prosperity, order, and security is why he deployed the United States Navy to combat piracy off the Barbary Coast at the dawn of the 19th century. And that's why, for over 2 centuries, we have helped keep the seas open for all and oppose those who seek to control the seas at the expense of America and our allies. Today, as outlined in the 2018 National Defense Strategy, nations like China and Russia are attempting to do just that, to stem the tide that has steadily lifted all boats by unilaterally redefining international norms on terms more favorable only to themselves. The nation and the Navy are responding with more than 60,000 sailors deployed on board nearly 100 ships and submarines at this very moment, by sustainably operating around the globe, advocating for our principles, and protecting our national interests. To maintain this worldwide posture, the President's FY20 budget offers a strategy-driven, future-leaning, and balanced approach to deliver a naval force up to the task in this era of great power competition. The single most effective way to maintain our strategic momentum is to provide adequate, stable, and predictable funding. This makes everything possible. It solidifies strategic planning, incentivizes our commercial partners, and mitigates operational risk by maximizing our planning and execution time. Mr. Chairman, as you noted, the foundation of our naval power is a force of talented and well-trained sailors. Important to our success, we remain committed to recruiting and retaining diverse shipmates whose intelligence, curiosity, energy, different backgrounds, and varied viewpoints will catalyze the speed and quality of our decisions we need to outperform our adversaries. And as well, working with Congress, we continue to transform our human resources systems to 21st century standards. This budget builds a bigger fleet, 55 Battle Force ships over 5 years, preserving our industrial base and strengthening our ability to prevail in any warfighting contingency. This budget fully funds the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine program, fulfilling our existential imperative to deter a nuclear attack on our homeland. This budget builds a better fleet, fielding state-of-the-art systems that are more agile, networked, resilient, and lethal. This budget recognizes that aircraft carriers will be central to winning the future fight, which is why it invests in the Gerald R. Ford class, delivering far more combat power for less cost over their lifetime than the Nimitz-class predecessors. This budget also builds a ready fleet, steaming days to exercise at sea, flying hours to train in the air, sufficient quantities of ammunition and spares, and the resources to conduct maintenance today and in the future as the fleet size grows. Meeting the nation's and the Navy's responsibility is not easy. It requires us all to work together, but this is why great nations and only great nations must do. At the dawn of the Cold War, as the nation took on the challenge to go to the moon, President Kennedy, a naval officer, said, "We do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one that we are unwilling to postpone, and one that we intend to win." I'm very grateful to this committee and to your colleagues in the Congress for your continued vigorous support. We look forward to sailing alongside you to build and deliver the safest Navy for our sailors, the strongest partner Navy for our allies and friends, and a Navy that is the worst nightmare for our enemies. I look forward to your questions.
Chairman Shelby, Senator Murray, distinguished members of the committee, I'm here to testify today on the FY20 budget and posture of your Marine Corps. And I thank you for that opportunity to be here today and to answer your questions. I know this committee, the Congress, and the American people have high expectations for their Marines. As our nation's expeditionary force and readiness, you expect us to be ready to operate forward with our Navy shipmates in the contact and blunt layers of the global operating model to assure our partners, deter our rivals, and respond to crisis across the range of military operations. And if we are unable to deter, we are called to fight, you expect us to win. As we hold this hearing today, approximately 40,000 Marines, along with many of our shipmates, are forward deployed or postured in more than 60 countries around the world, some of them in harm's way, all engaged, doing exactly what you would expect of them. Throughout our history, the nation has called upon their Marines to respond immediately to crisis around the globe, either from the sea, from forward bases, or from home station. To meet your intent to be ready to suppress or contain international disturbances short of a large-scale war, we strive to prevent war by assuring our allies and deterring rivals with ready, capable, and persistently present forces. Forward-postured naval forces remain critical to that end, providing the nation a significant operational advantage through their ability to maneuver, access, and physical presence around the globe. Supporting day-to-day operations through theater security cooperation, building partner capacity, doing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, or supporting current contingencies requires your force to be present. We recognize the strategic environment is constantly changing, requiring adaptations to our organization, our training, our equipment, and our warfighting concepts in order to provide our nation the lethal naval expeditionary force it demands. Your Marine Corps remains committed to building the most ready, capable, and adaptable force the nation can afford. This requires hard choices as we balance commitments to current operations work to continue to increase our readiness, and pursue modernization efforts designed to increase our competitive advantages over our rivals now and in the future. And thanks to your efforts in Congress to provide increased and on-time funding, you have made some of these choices far less difficult, and the rate of our readiness improvement and the pace of our ability to change has increased. The Secretary mentioned the situation at Camp Lejeune. Senator Murray also mentioned it, so I'll defer those comments and I'll take your questions in regard to where we are with restoring Camp Lejeune. But despite all these challenges, the Marine Corps remains on the right path as we implement the National Defense Strategy. We continue to develop effective warfighting concepts and invest in what we believe are the right capabilities while experimenting ruthlessly to validate these choices. Most importantly, to the success of our Corps, we continue to be able to recruit and train the most qualified men and women our nation has to offer, men and women who are willing to raise their right hand, have a desire to wear the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor, and ask to serve something greater than themselves, and then represent the best of our nation every day around the world. So your Navy Marine Corps team remains our nation's naval expeditionary force in readiness, forward deployed and postured, present and competing across the globe. And with Congress's continued support and commitment, we will ensure that if we must send our sons and daughters into harm's way, they'll have every advantage our nation can provide. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, the budget caps, as you well know, created by sequestration remain in effect for the fiscal years 2020 and 2021. What impact would a return to sequestration have on the Navy and Marine Corps, in your judgment?
Mr. Chairman, the efforts that you all have put forward for the RAA in 17, for the fiscal year 18-19 funding have been absolutely tremendous. If we revert back to that, it is absolutely devastating.
It'd be draconian, would it not?
Draconian.
Thank you. The committee is aware of the significant destruction by Hurricane Florence at Camp Lejeune and the Marine Corps air stations at New River and Cherry Point, North Carolina. We've seen your estimates that the recovery and rebuild cost is at least $3.7 billion. I'll direct this to you, General Neller. You stated that the inability to pay for hurricane damage is negatively impacting Marine Corps readiness. I could see that. Could you explain to the committee this morning how the hurricane damage is impacting the Marines' ability to train and to deploy and provide an update on the strategy to fund repairs, if you can?
Well, Chairman, we're used to and pride ourselves on being able to do with what we have. There was a generational storm that came ashore eastern North Carolina last September. The winds fortunately died down, so when it hit the coast, it was only about a 100-mile-an-hour storm. But it really wasn't the wind, it was the rain, and it sat there for 3 days in rain. So you're not going to see the damage at Lejeune, Cherry Point, and New River like you would see at Tyndall or down in the Panhandle, where you had a very Category 1 storm came across. We have many old buildings down there, many of them 40, 50, 60, and 70 years old. The advantage of new construction, I can tell you that all the new buildings, and there are many due to the generosity and the funding of the Congress, they suffered almost no damage at all because they were built to a higher standard. So we have a number of buildings, and we prioritized them. We could repair them, but we believe that the best way to fix this is to, if they need to be resited out of a floodplain, to put them in a better location and to build them to a higher standard so they can survive a future storm. Hopefully we won't get one this summer, but we have received $400 million of reprogramming from the Congress, and we appreciate the efforts of the Congress, Department of Defense, and the administration to do that. As the Secretary said, we could spend just under another $500 million this FY effectively, but if we rebuilt the whole thing, the total bill remaining less than $400 million, and there's $200 million for Marine Logistics Base Albany, it's just a little over $3 billion. So we're back in business, we're operating, but we're operating in a degraded status, and we're hoping that, obviously, hope is not a course of action. If we had another storm this year, there would be buildings that would probably become unoccupiable, but we're down there doing the best we can, but we need to fix these. We need to fix the infrastructure down there.
Thank you very much. The 2018 National Defense Strategy identified several technology areas where the U.S. must make investments to maintain a technological edge over our adversaries, to include hypersonics, directed energy, as well as advanced computing, including quantum, artificial intelligence, and, of course, cybersecurity. In order to advance in these technological areas, the Navy and Marine Corps needs to attract and retain people with highly valued skills in our economy. Secretary Spencer, could you describe the programs in the budget that support these technologies? And I'll direct the questions to the General and Admiral Richardson. Do the Navy and Marines have sufficient people with the right skills to excel in these advanced technologies? I know that's a big question.
It is a big question. Let me provide the Title X aspect of it, and then I'll defer to both the Commandant and the CNO. Due to the authorities that Congress has provided us, we do have much more flexibility now to attract, acquire, retain those resources we need in the areas that you're talking about, specifically human capital in those areas. We still, as we are competing with the corporate world outside, as I brought up earlier, we're also going to probably need some latitudes as salary caps, et cetera, on how to attract the people that we need, specifically when it comes to cyber, quantum computing, et cetera, because we are going to be competing with an open, competitive market, and we need to have access to that. But fundamentally, we'll be coming before you, I think, again in 20, fleshing out some more insight into it, but we do have what we need right now, and I'll defer to both the Commandant and the CNO as far as headcount might go.
Admiral Richardson, do you have anything to add?
Sir, with respect to the challenge of bringing in qualified people, I would say that we talk about great power competition, but the competition for talent is about as competitive as any contest that I'm in right now.
Does the fact that the economy is a little past being good, that
makes it
that
more
a challenge to you?
A recovering economy, rising salaries, all of that makes it more challenging for us. We're holding our own right now, Senator. I think that that has a lot to do with young people of America wanting to do something noble.
Wanting to do the service.
Yes, sir. And we're also mindful that when we bring them in, we've got to have 21st century human resource systems, and we've been working very closely with this committee to really transform our systems. And so combination of all that and just the terrific operations that the Navy's been involved in.
You're holding your own now, but it is a challenge in the future.
It's a great challenge, yes, sir.
Thank you. General?
I would agree with the CNO. We're making it, but as we bring on these more sophisticated technological capabilities, I think it's going to be more difficult. I think we're going to have to figure out how to leverage the civilian side. I think we're going to have to figure out how to have auxiliary forces or whatever that can come in and assist us, and have to get them through the security clearance process, which is another wicket that delays some people, because they want to, if they wanted to do it, we want to put them to work, and we have to sometimes wait for that. So we are competing, whether it be for pilots or air crew or engineers or cybersecurity people or people that operate in a high level of communications. We compete against the civilian side for that same capability, and having an additional resources allows us to pay bonuses or incentive pays or things like that, which can kind of bridge the gap between what they might make on the outside. But I agree with the CNO. The one thing that really keeps folks around is they have good equipment, they have good facilities, they know their families are taken care of, and they're the opportunity to do something important to serve their nation.
Thank you. In December of 2016, the Navy completed a force structure assessment, Mr. Secretary, to determine the correct balance and mix of platforms needed to address the Navy's responsibilities. You're very familiar with this.
Yes, Chair.
That report concluded that the Navy requires a minimum of 355 ships, and this committee has strongly supported the Navy's shipbuilding requirements, as you know. The 2020 budget request proposes to accelerate shipbuilding to reach 355 ships sooner, but the Navy is also conducting another force structure assessment to conclude later this year, is my understanding. What was the need to be conducted? Why the new assessment, and what do you expect will be the most likely outcome?
Again,
Can you address that, Mr.
I'll
Secretary?
give you the overview. Yes, when we shifted, when the National Defense Strategy shifted to the Great Power Competition, we took it upon ourselves to take the assessment. I will also let the CNO chime in here, but I can tell you that a bigger Navy is where we need to go. We're not going to shy away from 355. That I can tell you.
Admiral Richardson.
I would just pile on to what the Secretary said. The security environment's changed a great deal. Our strategy has responded to that. Technology has changed a great deal, as you alluded in your earlier
All of
question.
it, isn't it?
All of it has changed, and so it needed to be reassessed. I think this is what you expect us to do. But all of those, and particularly the security environment, has only become more complex. And so I would expect that our force structural assessment will recognize that increased challenge.
Shipbuilding, as you well know, all of you, requires a healthy and a robust industrial base for all of the vessels, from the big shipyards to the lower tier vendors. Is our industrial base right now adequately prepared to support the Navy's future shipbuilding, or do we have a challenge there too?
I'll step in here first, Chairman, because we have been watching this very closely and done a couple of reviews. I would say that the industrial base is adequate.
But could it get better?
It needs to get better. We've seen some great actions in the shipyards, both private and public, in the education area.
We can't let it erode anymore, can we?
We cannot, Mr. Chairman.
So that's where you are today, but you want it more robust.
We need to put some more muscle on it.
I have some more questions that I'd like to submit for the record, without objection. Senator Murray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Spencer, in January, I had the opportunity to tour the Bangor Child Development Center at Naval Base Kitsap in my home state of Washington. The level of care provided, the quality of the teachers was really impressive, but the facilities were among the worst I have ever seen, and I am a former preschool teacher. I have seen a lot of facilities. They were horrendous. Not only was it poorly designed, but it was out of date, and the waiting list at that installation is over 600. Our military families deserve better than this, and upgrading that facility has to be a priority. Can you tell me when the Navy plans to build a child care facility at Bangor for these families?
Senator, let me approach at 30,000 feet and then drill down. One of the things that did take me by surprise arriving here in this position 22 months ago was the fact that we had used infrastructure as a bill payer. We were funding somewhere around the neighborhood of 70% of infrastructure. We cannot go forward with that. Infrastructure is, in fact, readiness, and it is the key to readiness. You bring up an example right now. Child care, I can draw a line from child care right to readiness because it's about the family and support. We are, as you've seen in the budget, we're topping up infrastructure. I don't know exactly when Bangor is looking to receive a new building. I will get back to you on that.
Would you? I'd appreciate that. Okay, thank you for that. And for Admiral in general, I understand the demand for Navy child care worldwide exceeds capacity of over 8,000 spaces. Long wait lists, as you just mentioned, mean that our sailors and Marines are regularly forced to make tough choices about childcare. I saw communities trying to figure out how they could support it, and they don't have the money. People bring in families from elsewhere. Worst of all, I was talking to service members who were deciding to leave the service because their kids weren't getting taken care of. So this is really a critical issue. And General, let me start with you. Can you tell me, do you think childcare is, as the Secretary just said, a readiness and retention issue?
I agree 100%, Senator. This issue, a lot of other issues come up, but our issue, I'm not sure that we have and again, we're all part of the same team, and we have Marines that live on naval bases, and we have sailors that live on Marine bases. So it's not just the facilities and the capacity, it's also getting enough practitioners and people that are certified and trained and turnover and kind of the nature of the life. So it's a more complicated problem than even what we've discussed here. So,
True.
But it is clearly a readiness issue and a retention issue.
Admiral?
I see it just the same. I was just up in Washington State. My wife and I were both there. She visited the child care facility, shares your impression. We're on track to reconstitute that facility there. And I also share your impression that the quality of the people there, the care providers, is really good, right? They want to do a terrific job, and we're ready to. And as Secretary Spencer says, we recruit the sailor, but we retain the family, so we've got to solve this.
Is there a plan on childcare, Mr. Secretary?
Senator, we are looking at, this is a front and center issue, and we're looking at every solution we can, public, private, ourselves. As you know, this is a national issue also.
Yeah, it is.
And we are on it. I mean,
I just have to tell you, if I was a sailor and I was leaving my kids at that Bangor facility, I'd be worried every day I was deployed. And we just can't have that.
I agree.
Okay, well, I'm going to keep pursuing this. I think it's a critical readiness issue. Let me move on. Secretary Spencer, I was really disappointed that the Navy decided not to return the USS Nimitz to the Naval Station Everett, despite we got repeated promises from the Navy. It is a strategically located deep water port. You were just there. It's a critical national security asset, and it's a point of pride for that community. So whether it means adding more destroyers or other ships, or perhaps one day returning a carrier there, it's really essential that the Navy remain committed to this base and using its full capacity. And I wanted to ask you how you see the Navy using this critically important base in the future.
Senator, you're preaching to the choir when it comes to Everett. Having been up there twice, but most recently, I believe sitting down with 20 constituents from the community, talking about the fact that an aircraft carrier wouldn't come back, but the benefits that might come from this in making it a center of excellence for the DDGs we have up there. We added one, if I'm not mistaken, and there might be another one coming that way. If we could enhance the ability to have maintenance performed there, more deeper maintenance in Everett, and make it truly a center of excellence, it would be a win-win for both the Navy and Everett.
Okay, I'll pursue that with you. And just really quickly, Admiral Richardson, this year's budget increased the requirement for P-8A aircraft, but it didn't include funding for additional aircraft. Part of that increased requirement is to upgrade the aircraft of the Navy Reserve Squadron that operates the aging P-3 Air Fleet at Naval Air Station Whidbey Island. That performs an essential capability, but without upgrading their aircraft, I understand the squadron will be decommissioned by 2023. I wanted to ask you, does the Navy have a plan to upgrade the squadron's aircraft in the near term?
Yeah, that is part of the discussion. We're going to move all to P-8s. The P-3 is going to be sunsetted, and so it's just really a matter of time, Senator.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Collins?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Spencer, let me begin by saying that I look forward to welcoming you in a couple of days as you visit the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery, Maine, with both the Maine and New Hampshire delegations, and then go on to deliver the commencement address at Maine Maritime Academy. Both the shipyard and the academy are very excited about your visit. Admiral Richardson, I want to thank you for your service. I know you're a native of the great state of Maine, and I can't imagine that you'd want to retire anywhere but the great state of Maine, and hope that we will see you up there often. General Neller, you may not be from the great state of Maine, but I know that you've done an extraordinary job, and it is a good place to retire as well. So I just thought I'd put in my pitch. Admiral Richardson, we frequently discuss the Navy's role in the Pacific, but its presence in other parts of the world, namely in the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean, is also vitally important to the security of the United States and our allies in the region, particularly with Russia increasing its aggressive actions. And I know from CODELs that I've taken to that part of the world that there is great interest in having more of a naval presence there. And indeed, in a recent story in a military publication, the head of European Command says that he needs an additional 2 destroyers in his area of responsibility. Based on increased operations in the Mediterranean, as well as Russian maritime activity in the Baltics and in the Atlantic, do you believe that we have a sufficient number of ships in the Atlantic fleet?
There is always a strategic balance that's needs to be struck. It's a continuing conversation because the strategic environment is changing. But what we have seen, and we can show you the numbers, is a steadily rising commitment to naval power in the European theater. And so, as was noted earlier today, 2 carrier strike groups operating in the Mediterranean. We spent a lot more carrier strike group time in the Mediterranean, also working with our allies there. So the Stennis also operated with the French carrier Charles de Gaulle. We sent the Truman Carrier Strike Group north of the Arctic Circle up into the North Atlantic for the first time since 1991 and relearned a lot of lessons up there. We've been doing more theater ASW in the North Atlantic in response to the Russian undersea threat. And so we've seen an increasing commitment to operations and the threat scenario in the Atlantic.
And Mr. Secretary, just following up on the chairman's question, I assume that issues like this will be part of your new fleet architectural assessment, or I guess we now call it a force structure assessment, that you will look at those kinds of issues.
Most definitely, Senator.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, last year at this hearing, we discussed the Navy's plans for the next generation of surface combatants. The Navy has moved ahead very quickly with those plans since last year, with procurement of a new lead ship now scheduled for fiscal year 2025, which is just a couple of years after the end of the current multi-year procurement contract for the DDG-51 Flight 3s. Many of us in Congress, I will say, expected that we would see a subsequent multi-year contract for the Flight 3s. Given the challenges that lead ships often present in terms of initial budgeting and planning, as well as our past experience of transitioning to the DDG-1000 when we ended up only building 3, the last of which was dedicated just this past weekend, and then back to the 51s after buying none for 4 years. I do want to express some concerns about starting down the path to a new hull until the requirements have been thoroughly identified and validated, and industry has had the opportunity to help the Navy determine what truly is achievable. As everyone has said, stability is so important to maintaining that proven dual source surface combatant industrial base. I'd be interested in hearing more of your thoughts on how budgeting and planning for the next generation of large surface combatants will address that need to ensure stability and predictability in the industrial base.
Most definitely, Senator. I think one of the things, and we've been talking about it, is the stability of the industrial base. I want to say that certainly does not mean that the coffers of the Navy are wide open just for that purpose. We're going to make sure that we're getting the best value for our dollar, but we must weigh the stability of the industrial base at all times and its health. If I was to look at an intermediate step we're taking with the frigate, it is a fascinating exercise in that we're looking at proven hull design. We really are going to industry and saying, what do you have that we can adapt and adopt with minimal cycles of change? And we're going to have quite a robust competition with 5 hulls being put forward. What we learn from that, I think, is also going to transition to the large surface combatant. And we will do this on a budgeting manner that will take into account the health of the industry to make sure that we don't find ourselves in a gapping mode.
Thank you.
If I could just pile onto that a little bit.
Yes.
Just speaking for the requirements, one of the things that we're doing differently, and we did this with frigate as well, is to bring industry into the discussion of the requirements, right? So that we're not
critical.
Coming off with something that will just be impossible to invent and then build and then integrate. And so by virtue of doing that with the frigate and also the unmanned tanker, it's proven itself so that we have a much more confidence in the both cost and schedule, even of the lead ship, learning lessons from the past.
Thank you. Thank you,
Reed.
Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by thanking Admiral Richardson and General Neller for their extraordinary service, their integrity, their professionalism, and their insights that they provided, not only to this committee, but particularly to the Armed Services Committee. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your service. And the Navy and the Marine Corps thanks you also. Secretary Spencer and Admiral Richardson, let me focus for a moment on the Columbia class. As Admiral Richardson commented in his opening remarks, this is the #1 priority to maintain strategic deterrence. We've got to get those ships on the water by, I think, 2039 is
2031, sir.
to 2031. I'm giving you more time than you got. So the GAO issued a report on April 8th, and they stated, despite some of the positive steps that the program has taken to avoid the mistakes of past programs, the Columbia-class program's cost estimate, when combined with an aggressive schedule, no cost margin, and unyielding requirements, is more likely than not to be insufficient for a program of this size. With that report, are you anticipating asking for an increased authorization, not in this year's NDAA, but in the following years? Mr. Secretary?
Senator, we're set on our budgeting requirements as we need them right now, and authorities. I will tell you, as you've said, let me reiterate that the Columbia-class submarine program is our #1 acquisition program. As you know, that industry is an industry unto itself, so the Virginia-class program, which is our most successful program in the Navy, is hip to it. We are, as we speak, in the next 2 weeks, we are sitting down to do a finite drill down of not only the program itself, but the underlying supply chain that's involved with both of those programs to ensure that we do have a handle on this, and we are extracting margin when we can and performance where we can. The report is correct. We do not have a lot of margin, and this is right in front of us right now, but we plan to manage this through appropriately.
Thank you. And we created a National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund to help create efficiencies and effectiveness in the Columbia-class program. Are you still exploring ways you can use those funds to accelerate, and in this case, to stay on schedule, not to accelerate?
No, that is a great tool that has allowed us flexibility to be where we are, and we hope to use it to actually create some margins where we can.
And Mr. Secretary, you mentioned the Virginia-class. You've requested 3 Virginia-class submarines to be authorized and appropriated, but one of them is without the Virginia payload module. And either Admiral Richardson or yourself, why would we go ahead and complicate an already complicated program by sort of doing two steps forward and 1 step to the back, in a sense?
So I think it's not so much 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Really, the submarine industrial base, and I know, sir, you're very well read on this, is operating pretty close to its limits to the question that was asked earlier. And so it's really just a matter of making sure that the capacity is matching the program and dovetailing that Virginia payload module in just one submarine slower.
As the Secretary indicated, the Columbia and the Virginia class, because there's only basically 2 shipyards, they're working together, they're at the hip, linked at the hip. And if we complicate the Virginia class program by doing something like, well, we've been building the new modules, now we're going to go back to the old model, I think that adds more uncertainty, not just to the Virginia program, but also to the Columbia program, potentially. So I would leave that for your consideration.
Yes, sir.
We're talking about a 355-ship Navy, and we're talking about the future. What's your best guess at the moment about how many of those ships will be autonomous in 10 years?
I'll be happy to take that, sir. There's a big investment in our 20 budget request for unmanned vehicles of all types, airborne, surface vessels, and undersea. A lot of that is in research and development lines, because a lot of those questions that you have are the questions that we have. And so we're going to need to explore these, but we're going to need to explore them with some urgency, because this is a fast-moving thing. And we do not want to be the second Navy on the water to exploit unmanned autonomous technologies. But there's a lot of questions that go with that in terms of what their capabilities will be, weapons employment, the network that'll keep them tied in, and so that's why we're exploring.
No, I concur. I think not only in terms of just combat power, but as the deterrent effect. If if we can send ships without personnel into places and the other folks can't, they'll think twice. And just, if I may, a final comment. General Neller, I had the privilege of going out to Camp Shorab in Helmand Province and visit with 5 Marine reservists from Rhode Island. So your work is being felt and your leadership is being felt at that level. Very impressive, very inspiring. Thank you, sir.
Senator Moran.
Chairman Shelby, thank you. General Neller and Admiral Richardson, first, I want to join my colleagues in thanking you both for your service, tremendous, impeccable service to our country. Extend my congratulations and best wishes to you and your family upon your retirements. General Neller, you have an impressive 44 years of service to our nation. I think that sets a record for the Marine Corps. I, again, wish you well, and the first time we met, you spent a lot of time talking about your tomatoes, and I hope they now get your attention in this stage of your life. Admiral Richardson, you and I were together on a forum panel at the Reagan Defense Forum several years ago, and I want to remind you and thank you for assisting me in calling a young Kansan, Dawson Padella, from Topeka, and we congratulated him on his nomination by me and his acceptance by the Naval Academy. It was great. I'm not sure he knew what the chief was at the time, but I assume he now knows the significance of your notifying him of his acceptance to the Naval Academy. I'm proud of those folks we get to nominate, and I know they will serve the country well. And Mr. Secretary, you gave me a great honor, the opportunity to be in Florida and to help preside over the commissioning of the USS Wichita in January. I was reluctant, not knowing what I might say. It was a great ceremony and instilled in me, reminded me of the great patriotism and service to our country of you and those who serve in the Navy. And it was a great day to recognize Wichita, Kansas, the keeper of the plains and the Navy honored the USS Wichita, now the keeper of the seas. And again, thank you for that great opportunity. Speaking of Wichita, Mr. Secretary, we are an aerospace manufacturing capital, and engineering expertise abounds in Wichita, Kansas, known as the air capital of the world. You and I have had several conversations about the talent, particularly at Wichita State University, to support fleet readiness in the Navy and the Marine Corps. The university is the #1 industry-funded university for aerospace research and development in the country. Your F-18 fleet has been characterized as the backbone of the Navy. You've taken steps to address unacceptably low readiness rates and maintenance of that fleet. This time last year, I think 74% of the Marine Corps' F-18s were not ready for combat, but I understand that mission-capable rates have improved and maintenance remains a top priority. And I'm pleased that one way the Marine Corps is tackling this issue is partnering with Wichita State. I would ask you, Mr. Secretary, can you describe the partnership with Wichita State universities, but how will the Navy and the Marine Corps benefit from this private sector assistance?
Senator, it's interesting you bring that up because I actually use the Wichita State University as a venue to really present how we are doing things differently in Navy. Through the DoD Strategic Capabilities Office, which we call the SCO office, Marine Corps is working with Wichita State in a program called Paladin, where it is primarily, the front runner is data analytics to do predictive analytics. And what I mean by that is studying the wear, the tear of parts so we can predetermine through data analysis what parts will be needed and we have them ready in the bin. Sounds simple. It really is cutting-edge technology. Working with the university there. Also working with the university on the whole concept of a digital twin for the F-18. This is a model where we don't have to physically destruct anything anymore. We create the actual airframe in a digital environment, putting stresses on it, and with the algorithms we know from past histories, we can stress out and find out where limits are in certain areas of the plane. And then the automatic robotic scanning and drilling. At the end of the day, we still assemble aircraft. It is still science, but a lot of art. And the ability to put the hole in the right place, to put it simply, is very important. So 3 areas that we're working with Wichita State on. 10 years ago, probably not traditional. Now this is the way we want to think and work with our academic institutions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for that. A couple of years ago, I would not have understood much of what you just said, and now I do, and it is the future. It is the way that we can sustain and improve our readiness. Let me turn to General Neller. The CH-53K King Stallion. I would guess that you would agree with me that it is a most capable heavy lift helicopter in the world. The program of record for the CH-53K is 200 aircraft during the delivery. And during a delivery event in Wichita last June at Spiro Aerosystems, I recognized the start of low-rate production was at that point. The Marine Corps officer highlighted that helicopter's capabilities, and he said that the helicopters will support Marines who aren't even born yet. That's very pleasing to me. General, first, do you agree that the CH-53K will add value to the Marine Corps? And then second, do you believe that additional CH-53Ks in the FY20 would help ensure the aircraft remain affordable and also drive readiness to help replace the current fleet?
Senator, there's no doubt that we still have a requirement for the capabilities that this aircraft is going to give us. But based on the test and where we are on the test, and to put more money in the program as of yet, I think there's a number of engineering things that have to be fixed. So we've been able to get reprogram some money through Congress's support, so we can sort through some of these engineering things. And so once those are done, and I'm confident they will be done, I think we'll be in a better position to talk about increasing the production. So we have a handshake agreement, and I'll defer to the Secretary on this. We have a handshake agreement with the vendor to provide a certain number of aircraft this year, and I think we're in a good place. But this is all contingent upon them fixing some of these engineering issues they have, and they're making good progress. And so until they do that, I am somewhat reluctant to say we should add any more into the FY20 budget.
Do you have a time frame for what good progress means?
Every month we're checking on this.
Okay.
So we have a punch list with them of things, and we're going through it. And so by the end of this FY, we hope that they're going to be back on plane where they are with test. So some of the stuff is I think, easier than others, but I think the Secretary and Mr. Gertz, who works for him, have got the vendor to get a little more of their own personal skin in the game, if you will, to be incentivized to fix what needs to be fixed on this airplane. And I'll defer to the Secretary if he wants to add anything.
Senator, if I could just add a little more color here. This is a key Marine Corps acquisition platform. Bringing what the requirements of this aircraft are to life is game-changing, 3 times the lift of what we have now in the Echoes. But it has to be balanced with cost. And to be very frank with you, on the development of this, it's been on my radar since arrival. The Commandant did touch on it. Shall I say we realigned our partnership with the vendor. We are now true partners. We're sharing risk, and we'll share reward together. We put together a schedule that has gating events for the reprogrammed money, so we do have the ability to see what is being knocked down, what is being checked off, and we will work the resources that we have on a progress path in that regard. This is a key focus.
Thank you both.
Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Spencer, the DoD report assessing the strength of the manufacturing and defense industrial base from last fall expressed serious concerns, and I quote, "Currently, the industrial base faces an unprecedented set of challenges: decline of critical markets and suppliers, unintended consequences of U.S. government acquisition behavior, aggressive industrial policies of competitor nations, and the loss of vital skills in the domestic workforce." And it sounds like, based on previous questions, that you share those concerns. Is that true?
Most definitely.
Okay. We ceded much of our commercial shipbuilding industrial base to foreign competitors and governments back in the 1980s. which is why we have laws that protect U.S. shipbuilders from unfair foreign competition. We also have a law that critical components on sea lift ships must be manufactured in the U.S., but as you know, that does not apply to ships that are procured through the SCN account. Do you believe that our suppliers are thus disadvantaged against foreign suppliers, and are there specific areas that concern you the most?
Senator, you've hit on obviously the highlights of that report, which you asked me, and I'll say it again. Those are all of tremendous concern, to be very frank with you, because we all focus on weapons, whether they be bullets, whether they be F-35s coming off a production line, but it's all that's involved in supporting that production line that is equally, if not more important, because if the components aren't there, we can't build it. That being said, there are two things to look at. One, that is the key driver to answer your question about foreign competition or for parts, are we at economic capacity? If we're at economic capacity, I would like to open the ability for foreign parts, because I need the parts in general. If we aren't at foreign capacity, where we still have capacity, we should be working with our industrial base to ensure that we're taking advantage of that capacity. Again, I'm going for the best value, but yet the most efficient and effective product for us.
And do you believe that we're at economic capacity?
Depends upon, Senator, which area
component.
you're looking at. Yeah.
All right. Obviously, if we become reliant on foreign sources, we risk our ability to sustain and support those systems, and I would argue even submit ourselves to cybersecurity risks and the uncertainty of a foreign supply chain. So if there are concerns about sustaining critical sources for components, then should the Navy's acquisition plans ensure that we don't unfairly disadvantage U.S. suppliers?
Most definitely.
Last year at this very hearing, you stated that, quote, setting the conditions for an enduring defense industrial base was one of the Navy's top priorities, and that growing the fleet to 355 would require a strong and integrated relationship with private sector partners, prime contractors, and suppliers. I completely agree with those sentiments, Mr. Secretary, and I hope that we can work together to ensure that our U.S. industrial base and supply chain are made stronger and more resilient over time, because it's not only about the health of the industrial base. It's good for the U.S. economy, but it's also critical to our national security.
You have my commitment there, Senator.
Thank you. I want to join in the sentiments of my colleagues in thanking you, General Neller, for your service. And I have a couple of questions or comments for you as you look towards your retirement. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to be in a hearing with Secretary Wilkie in which we discussed the issue of veteran suicide. And it was noted at our hearing that of the 20 veterans who die by suicide each day, 14 of them are not in contact with the VA. I recognize the efforts that DOD has undertaken itself in combating suicide, but I'm fearful that we're not doing enough during transition to highlight the benefits of the VA. And especially for Marines who don't have who may or not have visible or physical injuries, and who may not want to enroll in at separation. So, General, I know that once a Marine, always a Marine. So I want to work with all the services and the VA and my colleagues in the Congress to reverse this trend of Marines choosing not to utilize the quality care available from the VA. But I wonder what recommendations you have to get more Marines into the VHA system or to increase enrollment among eligible separated Marines?
Well, Senator, I'm confident, and I'll go back and check, but when every Marine is required to go through a transition assistance program
Right.
before departing the service, whether they're completing their initial enlistment or they're anywhere even to retirement. And so, and once you do that, you register, and then the VA sends you, as I'm starting to get, you get emails from the VA about this program or that program. And so at some point, though, it becomes the responsibility of the individual that they're going to have to take advantage or acknowledge that these things take place. So I think all the service chiefs and all the senior enlisted, where everybody's aware of the issue of suicide, whether it be within the active force, the reserve force, or the retired or the former service members. I know, talking to a lot of people that have already gotten out, most units, they stay in touch with each other. They connect with each other, they on social media, they help each other, they check on each other. But it's just kind of the difficulty of this whole issue that the nation's dealing with suicide, because talked to a lot of people when somebody that they've been in touch with, trying to help, trying to work with, trying to support, and they still end up making that decision. It's pretty devastating. One thing we've done is try to get units to have more reunions, particularly units, you know, once you're in a unit, that unit has a heritage, has a legacy, goes back maybe to World War II, or it's a ship, and there's association. So there's, whether it's Marine Corps League or the Veterans for Foreign Awards or American Legion, all these groups are out there trying to reach out, particularly to the younger veterans, to try to get them involved. So I think all of them are working on it. I think you can help just by continuing to raise the issue and talk about it. When you go back to your home state and talk to, you know, Navy League, Marine Corps League, all the different service organizations, and ask them how are they doing with engaging with the newer veterans, because there's going to be a new generation, because a lot of the, you know, a lot of these folks, the Vietnam guys are even starting to get up in the years. And so my question to them is, what are you doing to replenish your membership? So I think that's how you could really help us, and just continue to raise the issue and talk to folks about taking advantage of the many of the programs that are out there to help them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Bozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. I just came off a trip with the chairman where we were able to see the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command Area up close and personal. We got some great briefings, and really just some really good examples of the good job that you and your sister forces are doing in that part of the world to keep not only our country safe, but our allies. So again, a big pat on the back for that. I also, like Senator Moran, had the opportunity to speak at a christening of the Little Rock, and it was done in Buffalo. It was the first time they'd ever, the old Little Rock is retired there and as a museum, and so, you know, the new ship was christened alongside. It was a great experience. Had the opportunity to talk. My concern during the talk was that my teeth were chattering so much that anybody would be able to hear me. Great crowd, thousands of people there, and really was a tremendous opportunity. Admiral Richardson, General Neller, we appreciate your service so much. Not only outstanding careers, but really just great examples, and like I say, we appreciate that very, very much. We had the opportunity to visit General Neller about what's gone on with Hurricane Florence, Camp Lejeune. I don't think most people realize that the Marine Corps doesn't have the bases spread out all over the place like the rest of the services. We're actually going to go to Camp Lejeune later in the month and see firsthand, and again are committed to helping any way that we can. Can you talk a little bit about in regard to the resources that you spent? I think you had $400 million. Can you give us an update on what's going on there? And then also, what more is still needed? What are the impacts to readiness if you don't get the help that you need?
Well, Senator, as you and I have discussed, you know, we've come up with what we think is it's a lot of money but we believe to repair the buildings would be much cheaper, but these are older buildings. Some of them were already scheduled to be raised and rebuilt, and that was in the budget. And so that's part of the cost. But for us to pay this bill out of our own resources without some sort of supplemental or reprogramming would probably take our MILCON budget for the next 5 years. And as the Secretary said, MILCON always is kind of the bill payer for other things as you reprogram, right, or as you decide to make the choices that you make. So we believe we could have spent about $885, just under $900 million this year. Some of we provided out of our own resources. The majority of that, the $400 million, was from reprogramming that was approved by the Congress, from money that the Department of Defense was able to put up for reprogramming. So we still think we could spend another $450 million to get it on contract to use it effectively. We're hoping that in the budgets, this budget that we're talking about today and future budgets, that there'll be additional money to help repair buildings where it makes sense, but in most cases, these buildings need to be replaced, and we have a master plan to do that, and I think we've costed out, and so that's kind of what we're trying to get people to see, that we need to do this. You know, the Department of Defense is not a self-insured organization. We rely on the Congress to appropriate the money if we have a huge disaster like we've had with Hurricane Florence, just like the folks up in Offutt had with the floods, and others have had with fires, and Tyndall down in Florida had with Hurricane Michael. So that's kind of where we are. We'll continue to build, operate. I mean, the housing was damaged there, but that's being paid for and fixed consistently, not as fast as we'd like, but it's getting done by the public-private venture. So the housing thing is being taken care of, and it will be taken care of when we're working with them. So the readiness, I think, is just operating in substandard facilities. The electrical grid's at risk. You've got people working in office spaces or have moved other places because their buildings, you know, lack heating or air conditioning. And the real concern is we have another big storm. You've got hangars where the workspaces were damaged and they patched them, and it'll work as long as we don't have another storm. We're going to have another storm. And so this is an issue not just for us, but others that live on the coast, because a lot of the military facilities of the nation are postured, particularly with the naval force, on the coastline, because that's where we generate our power from, and that's where we deploy from.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Schatz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary General, Admiral, thank you for being here. Admiral and General, thank you for your career of service. Thank you for your partnership with the state of Hawaii, with the United States Senate. I really appreciate it. General Neller, I want to talk to you about Guam. Where are we with moving Marines to Guam? Where are we with LIFT? Where are we with training facilities?
Senator, we're still on the current DPRI approved implementation plan. So there's MILCON that's going to be awarded or design awarded later this year that will put us in a position where the force type that goes to Guam will start to be solidified. We've said, and the Marine Corps has always said, and my predecessors always said, they were content to go to Guam if we have decent quality of life or acceptable quality of life, which I believe we will with the current plan, that we get the lift to be able to move to different training venues, and we have a place to go train that's in the vicinity, particularly in the Northern Marianas chain. With the training, there's still discussions going on with the government and the environmental impact, so that is yet to be played out.
Right. And then LIFT?
To be determined. And LIFT would have to come. There is right now, and I've talked to the CNO about this recently, there are high-speed vessels or other platforms that could be used to move forces in the general area, but to pick forces up of any substantial size, you would need strat lift, which is available. You'd have to resource it and pay for it, or you'd have to have amphibs come from either Japan or from the West Coast to pick Marines up to move them around, or you would have to contract.
But why? I mean, listen, I don't have military background, but it seems to me that if the purpose of having Marines on Guam is to be in the region, is to be forward, is to be ready to fight tonight. And then there's a moment and you got to fight tonight, and then you got to wait for San Diego to bring you the lift. It defeats the purpose. You might as well keep the Marines on CONUS or in Hawaii. So tell me why this plan still makes sense, other than our geopolitical commitments and the difficulty on Okinawa.
Well, the plan on Okinawa makes sense because they are building the Fatema replacement.
Sure.
I mean, that's going to happen. It's going to take a little longer than we thought. There have been a lot of discussions about this, and
what's your personal view? Does this make sense still?
the plan as currently designed, I think is worthy of possibly a review. That's my personal professional opinion.
Thank you. Secretary Spencer, you and I have had multiple conversations about Red Hill. And I just have a very simple question for you. Do I have your commitment, do I have the department's commitment that you will not allow any petroleum product into the Pearl City aquifer?
You do, Senator. We are your neighbor. Obviously, the whole Hawaii infrastructure is tremendously important to us, and we will be a responsible neighbor in that regard.
Okay. Secretary Spencer, Secretary Shanahan set a May 10th deadline to list which MILCON projects could be used to pay for the $3.6 billion in DHS border wall projects. Have you given a prioritized list of projects to defund?
Not yet, Senator.
May 10th is the deadline?
Correct. I have not gotten input yet. We went through the first cycling, which was the actual date-driven filter, and that's all I've gone through so far.
Will this committee or the Congress receive these lists prior to the 10th or on the 10th?
That would be the Secretary, sir.
Okay. Admiral Richardson, how much is the Navy short in its shipyard maintenance account this year?
It's a running number. We sent over the unfunded priority list, which is
Can you give me a range?
it's about I think about 100 million.
Okay. General Neller, the Marine Corps had to divert sustainment funding to pay for hurricane recovery at Camp Lejeune. How much more are you going to need to just for the cleanup?
For the cleanup, I think we've already done the cleanup, Senator. I think what we're looking to do is we had the money to be able to clean up, take out the mold. There's still some other remediation, but the $400 million that we've been given from Congress is going to lead us into that direction, and we believe we can spend another $450 million this year.
Thank you.
Senator, let me just revisit. It's 100 million for ships, about 150 million, and then if you add on the attack submarines, it's about 800 million total.
800 million total. Thank you.
Senator Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate your service and the people you represent. The FY20 Overseas Contingency Operation budget for Navy Marine Corps is $30 billion more than FY19 budget. Increases primarily under Navy operations and maintenance for accounts such as airlift maintenance, ship operations, flight operations, base operations. The FY20 budget, on the other hand, is $20 billion less than the FY19 budget. Secretary Spencer, can you explain why we're shifting tens of billions of dollars from the base budget to the OCO budget?
Senator, when I generate my numbers, they're gross numbers, and that's where I look at them. I do not have an answer for you in that regard.
Okay. Can you get me an answer in that regard?
I will get you an answer, Senator. Thank
you very much, Mr. Secretary. Secretary Shanahan recently testified that there are roughly 21,000 fewer non-deployable service members because of DOD's deploy or get out policy. Look, I think we all have concerns about policies to arbitrarily force out service members who may be dealing with problems like mental health, behavioral issues, and not getting the help they need. Is the Navy and Marine Corps keeping track of how many service members are separating because of this policy, the reasons for the separation, the character of their discharge?
We are, sir. We can get you some information on that if you'd like. I'll follow up with detailed information. We do track it.
That'd be great. I'm also concerned about the lack of resources dedicated to guardsmen and reservists seeking mental health care. I mean, this is a huge issue. We can go up and down. We can have hearing after hearing on this because we're losing far too many folks because of mental health. Because of that, we introduced with Jerry Moran the Care for Reservists Act. The bill assists men and women by providing them access to vet centers and VA mental health services. Secretary Spencer, are there resources in your budget request, to expand mental health services for soldiers, especially those who are in the Guard and Reserve who have not been activated?
I think, as you might know, Senator, we have the program that, again, is almost a poster child program, the outreach program, which is one of the ones we're funding that we use as a good venue, which is for those reservists that are in rural areas, to make sure we can touch people in the rural areas. And yes, when it comes to active duty transition to non-active duty, we address the fact that in the transition assistance program, the availability of the resources are made present to the candidate who's leaving. It is a key of ours. We realize that just as important on retention of our people, the transition to their non-active duty life is just as important.
And when you talk about availability for reservists, are you also including the guardsmen in that too, in that statement?
That's not in my wheelhouse. I'm reserve only in the Navy Marine Corps.
Okay, I got you. Sorry. Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hoven.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Admiral, thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks for your service. And first, for Admiral Richardson, General Goldfein was in front of this committee not too long ago, and we talked about the nuclear triad and his commitment to the nuclear triad, not just the Air Force aspect, the long-range bombers, but also the ICBMs. He also expressed his commitment to the submarine fleet and the need for a triad, all three legs. I'd like your comments on the necessity of having all three. I'm guessing you're probably a pretty strong proponent of the submarine leg.
That's a safe assessment, sir.
Yeah, you can comment on that, but I'd like to understand your feeling about the entire triad and the importance of the triad.
Sir, we've analyzed this over and over and over and come to the same conclusion that the deterrent power of the nation is best served by a triad with all three legs.
And with what's going on in terms of weapon development on the part of our adversaries like Russia, China, and others, would you say it's increasingly important that we not only have a commitment to the triad, but that we have a commitment to upgrading and modernizing the triad, nuclear
Absolutely.
triad?
Without question, sir, and that's why the Nuclear Posture Review reinforced that every aspect of the triad, including not only the legs, but the command and control that connects that with the National Command Authority, and also looking at some low-yield weapons and sea-launched cruise missiles as well.
And I would ask the similar question both to the Secretary and to General Neller. Mr. Secretary.
I can only reverberate what the CNO just said, Senator.
Thank you, General Neller.
The Joint Chiefs have looked at this, and we support the posture review, and I support the comments of Admiral Richardson.
For both the Secretary and the Admiral, are we on schedule with development of the new Columbia-class boomers? And do you feel we're on track? Are there major challenges or concerns that you have?
I'll be happy to take that, sir. We are on schedule, but just on schedule. And we are on cost, but just on cost. And so both the Secretary and I have made it very clear that looking forward and anticipating those things that will inevitably arise during testing and everything of such a complex program, we need to work diligently to build more margin into the program.
Secretary Spencer, recently the USS North Dakota was at Annapolis for the cadets to take a look, and we're very proud of that submarine and its crew, and it was just returned from some very impressive missions. And we're pleased that that's the submarine they brought up for the cadets to see. Usually you bring your top performers when you want the future looking at it. So we took that as a very positive sign. They are truly impressive. And the Virginia-class submarine construction program, procurement, building, development has been a real success story. On time, on budget, the way we want things to roll. I see now you're asking for a third submarine. To to be built this year of the Virginia class. Can you do that and stay on schedule, as we talked about with the Boomer, given the tightness that the Admiral just expressed?
Senator, that's a valid question. As we look at the importance of Columbia, you can't overlook Virginia, because in this industry, we're all in the same environment with those two platforms. You've heard the CNO's comments about we are on schedule tightly, and we are on budget tightly. There is no room to slip, and we're managing Virginia in the exact same way. The third submarine would deliver as a 2023 down the line. We are sitting down, interestingly enough, the timing of this, I think in 2 weeks, with the CEOs of our two primes to really make sure that we have the full assessment of risk in that regard.
Well, you've certainly done well with the Virginia-class program, and I commend you for that. That is how we want all of these
Yes.
programs to run, and we can't take that for granted when we see a program that's as well run as that one has been. General Neller, my father was in the Marine Corps. He was always incredibly proud of that until the day he died. Even though he was retired, you still had to say he is a Marine, not that he was a Marine, although since now he's passed, I can't say he was a Marine. But I thank you for your service. One of the challenges I see is with these young people, we put them into hot zones around the globe, and we have such an incredible set of expectations for them that go beyond the war fight. As you're recruiting these young men and women into the force, how do you train them? How do you prepare them for all these things that go beyond the war fight as we put them into locations around the world, and it involves so many other geopolitical aspects? Is there an aspect to the training now that takes that into account for these young people and the difficult situations that they're thrust into?
You know, the go where I tell you to go and do what I tell you to do, and you don't need to understand it days, I think, are gone.
The complexity is unbelievable.
I'm not sure they ever existed, but particularly now. And so I believe that you have to understand the rules of engagement, you have to understand the culture and the political environment that you've been set into, you have to understand different things about the country you're in and the history, and that's all part of the training process. So the young men and women that serve in all our armed forces, I think when they're forward deployed, their performance is exemplary. They're competent, they're smart, they're focused. They understand, they have something to sight on, they have that mission. So that's really not the concern for me. The concern is when that mission is over and they come home and there's no way you can replicate that same energy of focus at home station. Training's training, real's real. And so I could show you this is how it's supposed to look when they're forward deployed. And then the great majority come back and they do a great job too, but it's more challenging back in what we would call a garrison environment. And so I'm confident that we're doing what we need to do, explain the realities of the environment that they're in. I think they're aware of what's going on in the world. They're aware of great power competition. They're grown as digital natives. They have access to communications and information. And then those ways, they're hugely advantaged as the way we weren't maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago. But they also are subject to other influences that we weren't subjected to 15 or 20 years ago. So I'm confident that they understand what the context that they're in, which I think is supportive of why they're doing such a great job.
Is your force strength adequate for the missions that you're called on to do, and are you able to recruit to it?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you for your service. Thank you for your leadership. First question for you, Admiral Richardson, and just so you all know, all the questions will be about the Arctic. No surprise. But Admiral, when you appeared before the Senate Armed Services Committee back in April, you mentioned that you signed on to a strategic outlook for the Arctic, which you said talked about the strategic objectives to defend U.S. sovereignty up in the Arctic. Can you briefly summarize the conclusions that were reached in that strategic outlook and also more specific to this committee, what sorts of funding needs the Navy will require to accomplish those strategic objectives?
Yes, ma'am. It raised a couple of major points, and I'll be happy to provide you more details
Look
for the
forward to that,
record. In fact, I'll give it, the whole outlook itself is
Great.
available. But it talked, as you said, about defending our sovereignty, to make sure that we manage the dynamic situation in a stable and conflict-free way, that we are mindful of our responsibilities up there to preserve the freedom of those seas and those international passages, and then also to be mindful that we are part of a group of Arctic nations that have to operate together in a collaborative way to manage these, I guess, emerging opportunities is the way that you would best characterize it. So the strategy talks through all of that, and then points to making sure that we spend sufficient time up there so that we become familiar with the unique aspects of operating in the Arctic.
And then specific to that, how does this budget reflect some of those priorities and making sure that we are spending sufficient time?
Right, I think most of that would come through our operation and maintenance budget as we start to budget for those exercises that would go up there. In fact, Senator, as you're aware, we've increased the number of exercises that we've done up there. Several exercises in 2018 and 2019, over and above historical norms. We've been consistent with our submarine ice camps up there. We sent the Harry S. Truman Strike Group north of the Arctic Circle for the first time since 1991. And we've got more planned, a major exercise with the Marine Corps up in Alaska this fall, and looking forward to continuing to build our skills there.
Let me ask you, Secretary Spencer, and I appreciated the conversation that we had discussing ADAC in some depth. Can you share with me, with as much specificity as you can, the Navy's immediate and future intentions for the use of the facilities there in ADAC, specifically whatever amphibious exercises, the use of the airstrip, and really how you might intend to utilize ADAC, whether you're adequately funded to do so in the near term, and then also if you can address, again, as specifically as you can, the Navy's interest in a deep water port in the Bering Sea, and where you are in any conversations with regards to funding of that.
Yes, Senator. As we talked, and to, again, amplify what the CNO said, one of my first events being Secretary of the Navy was the Arctic Council in Reykjavik, and it truly was an eye-opener for me, because sitting across the table was our Russian counterpart talking about the 10,000 Spetsnaz he has up there and the runways that he's bringing back to life for search and rescue. So it really was an eye-opener. And then as we started to peel the onion back, you saw all the Arctic countries, what they're doing up there, but more importantly and more concerning is the backbench countries that are not Arctic countries but are now putting themselves into the area. So it is a definite area of concern, and the United States Navy and Marine Corps is taking that into account. When it comes to ADAC, the concept there is to do an exercise, amphibious exercise. There's an airstrip there, as you know, which will be involved also. We're talking
It's
about,
more than an airstrip. It's a pretty darn good
it is. You have
airport
regularly
there.
scheduled service in there, I think, three
Right.
times a week.
Yes.
And we're talking about bringing the P-8s up there for possibly the exercise also. It is a gem of a place to train. I know the Marine Corps has looked at it intently for this summer, for the September exercise. We also have a May exercise coming up where we're doing something more on the mainland of Alaska with ship-to-shore refueling and some other exercises that we'll be doing. When it comes to the port, while we do not have a requirement for a port, yes, having a deep water port such as Nome would be an advantage in the area. This summer, the CNO and I have talked about having an exercise to go to the Bering Sea. We're still exploring to see if we could do a full passage. There's still ice up there in some places. We've been in the high Atlantic with the Truman. All of these are the beginning of the drumbeat that you will see us with regular operations in the Arctic.
Well, you know, we welcome that. We think that it is of a necessity. You mentioned Arctic Council. I'm going to be going over to Finland next week for the Arctic
Excellent.
Council there with the Secretary of State. you mentioned those countries that are not Arctic countries that are engaged. I'm going to be participating in yet another Arctic conference that will be held in Shanghai. So if you have other nations that are clearly non-Arctic nations that have as keen an interest as we are seeing right now, I am pushing us at all levels, at all departments, to be engaged, to stay engaged. General Neller, twice now, the Marines and their activities have been mentioned here. You clearly have interest in ADAC, but we're also interested in whether the Marine Corps might find the cold weather training opportunities in and around the interior part of the state desirable. I know that you have looked a little bit at the Northern Warfare Training Center. Do you see increased use of that, or is the mindset here going out to the Aleutians in the ADAC area?
Senator, there's never too many places to go train.
And we've got lots.
And you've got a lot of
you
space.
know.
So
they make you tough.
whether there's aircraft going to Eielson and doing the instrumented ranges up there, which is a great place to go because it's the biggest airspace we have to go train. There's a Marine Regimental Headquarters and some HIMARS rocket artillery up there right now, doing an exercise in support of NORTHCOM and INDOPACOM. You mentioned the exercise this fall. So we've had more Marines in Alaska the past 3 or 4 years than I think we've had in the distant past. So we have our own organic warfare training center for mountains in California, but they do collaborate with the Army unit up there. So we're always looking at places to train or to deploy to get advantage of the training areas, and there's great training there at Elmendorf, Richardson, and also up at Wainwright. So we continue to look at that, and it'll be tied to where we end up at the end of the day with the Pacific laydown.
Well, know that we look forward to working with all of the respective branches as we're paying appropriate attention to what is happening up in the Arctic. So thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to extend my time.
Thank you, Senator. We appreciate your appearance, Mr. Secretary, Admiral, General. Before the committee today, there'll probably be some additional questions submitted by other senators that were attending other committees today. Subject to all that, I'd hope you would answer those within a reasonable time if they're submitted to you. Now, the Defense Subcommittee will reconvene on Wednesday, May the 8th at 10 o'clock a.m. to receive testimony from the Acting Secretary of Defense. Until then, the subcommittee stands in recess. Thank you.